Okay, now we can start, right? Okay, so what I'm getting at is if you're interested in lockpicking by the end of this, or physical security to any extent, you probably want to talk to Colin over here. He can't do the full presentation because, exams and whatnot. So, yeah, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, I recommend you talk to him when we have time. But otherwise, I'll get started. If I find my mouse, there we go. Ignore the date. We definitely made this recently, and it's definitely my slides. So basically, we're going to just kind of start off and go over the pin tumbler lock, which is the lock that pretty much everything uses, really, kind of. More secure things will use different ones. But generally, a lot of the stuff that we're going to show you are going to be these, and they're probably the most straightforward to lock or to lock pick. They're not the easiest, but they're probably the best to learn on. So basically, there's five major parts to these. Why is everybody getting pizza now? You have the housing of the actual lock itself. You have the springs at the top that you can see that keep the pins down when the key is out. And then you have so the plug is where the keyway goes into and it rotates. So it's kind of so when you turn your key, that's the whole thing rotates. You have the driver pins, which are in blue. Sometimes they're the same length, sometimes they're not. And then you have the key pins at the bottom, which are right up against the key, and those are variable length. So that's what when you see on a key how they have a different kind of there's a shape it goes up and down and whatnot. The key pin's length is mainly what determines that. And so the whole lock works essentially is when you put the key in, all the key pins the tops line up against the top of the plug, which is the shear line, and that allows the whole cylinder to rotate. So as you can see in this little picture here, so in 3 and 4, all the key pins are lined up. Right, so it looks kind of like this. Again, key pins are at the bottom, and then you have the drivers at the top. Right, so the whole thing with modern locks and why they're kind of flawed is tolerance. It's really hard to make something that is super, the dimensions are all exacts. I think like, for F1, for making a bolt, just one bolt, it costs like $10,000 or something because it needs to be so perfect. We can't do that for locks. If we did, nobody would have them. And well, we don't want that. But the other thing that is important with tolerances is if you drop a perfectly designed lock and you drop your key and you shave off just a bit, it won't work anymore. So all locks are very tolerant. There's, everything has a little bit of space to move around, which that means that there's a lot of wiggle room that we can exploit to break into them. Right. So for pin tumbler lock, I already talked about this. So actually, for exploiting that tolerance is you're going to put tension on it. So this is a tension rod. We're putting tension against the cylinders or the pins in the cylinder. We're pushing them up against the wall. It's not going to turn, but what's going to happen is one of them is going to lock against it, right? So for the handheld locks, you're going to see they all rotate clockwise. So keep that in mind when you try to break into these. But the main theory is that if we push the whole keyway over, we can jam one of those pins against the wall. And if we apply some pressure upward, we can get those driver pins to snap up into place. And then they won't fall back down because the cylinder rotates a bit. So if you move the yep. So and then what happens is because there's different tolerances, you'll usually get one pin, cylinder that binds it, and you can move on to the next one once that one locks in. So, right. So this is kind of what happens. You push the whole thing up, and then that the green kind of cylinder moves over just enough to lock the driver pin at the top, and then you can move on to the next pin. Right, so for basic single pin picking, which is kind of the best to get familiar with it, there are easier methods. But just for single pin lock picking, so you put tension on the cylinder so you can get one of the pins to lock against the wall. You'll push the pin, the hook up against that pin to get the driver pin to snap up. You'll feel the cylinder rotate a bit. You'll hear a click, and you move on to the next pin, so forth, so forth. So if we look at, we do have a video here.
Let's get started.
Yeah, this guy. But so if you see this is a side view, obviously. So there's the tension rod at the bottom, and you can see he's going one by one, moving each pin up. And you see how some of them are easier to move than the others because the tolerances are different. There's different tension on each pin. So they all kind of snap up into place. See that one in the back is a lot of tension on it. So I'll push that up. And then the lock doesn't open, so we'll start from the beginning again. And so that's the last one that isn't in place. And once it snaps up, the whole cylinder rotates. So, come on, there we go. All right, so with tension, a lot of this is by feel. You're gonna, if you try and single pin pick from the start, it's gonna be pretty difficult. you need to get a feel for where the pins are, what the distance is, how much tension to put on it. It's a thing that you're gonna have to learn by feel. It's a little tough, but uh, generally, I don't know what to tell you here. If you put in too much tension, you're gonna put way too much friction on the pins. It's gonna be really hard to move them and tell what's binding. And if you do push them too hard, they'll overset, which is what happens when the key pin at the bottom gets way past the shear line, and now you have to restart because the pins are too high, and you have to release the cylinder for them to fall back down. But if you put in too little tension, nothing is gonna bind, or if they do bind, they're not gonna lock in place, and then you're not gonna get anywhere. So another way for lock picking that I think this is the way you should probably start with, just to get an idea of what's happening, is rake picking. Basically, you just brute force your way through it, and you put the rake pin back and forth across all the pins. And the idea is you move all the pins, and eventually they'll all lock into place. It's for basic locks, and as the original maker of the slide says, and master locks, which are basic locks, this is going to work just fine. But we'll get into some security measures. This is why that won't quite work. But here's the same video. And we'll let him. All right, so you push up against all of them at the same time, and eventually, if you do it correctly, it'll lock or unlock. Yeah, so you move all of them at once, and eventually you'll unlock all of them. So kind of brute force does kind of work. Uh, tensioning. Right, so with this is a little bit, you have to be a little bit more I don't know what the right, you have to finesse it a bit more, I guess. You don't want to put all the pins up too far because if you rake it too high, you'll overset something because you're pushing so many things at once. But as it says here, no real technique, just brute force it, which is why a lot of people don't, this is one of those things that lock pickers won't actually like doing because it's too easy or whatnot. But picking on a budget, so I guess you could make your own lock pick stuff with paper clips. Don't try them on a real lock, you'll break it. I actually have done that before, so please don't do it. But I honestly wouldn't recommend it. We have some lock picks we have some lock picks here for you to try once we're done with the talk, and a bunch of locks. So hopefully you can get some experience from that if you want to. Don't do that, even though it says it here. General picks, do not pick any locks that are in use. Please, for the love of God, don't do that because you can break them. Even with actual tools, you can't break them. Not to mention that it is, illegal and whatnot. But yeah, don't do that. The whole ethics thing you agree to every time you sign in that everybody reads. Follow that. Don't use lubricant in locks if you try to, because what happens is metal shavings and whatnot can kind of ruin the lock. So there's special kind of lock lubricants that you can use if you ever need to do that. You'd only really need to do that if you're trying to break into something. So uh, you know, uh, and yeah, like it says here, it takes practice. It's definitely a feel thing you have to get used to, figure out where pins are, what it feels like to move each one and whatnot. But as for why I kind of mentioned that rake picking is not that effective is we know that these locks have been hard to or easy to pick for quite a while. Manufacturers keep trying to do different things to make it harder. At the end of the day, it's kind of hard to make it impossible to lock or impossible to pick, but there are some things that make it harder, and that's what these security pins are. Which basically you have different kinds of pins. You see here, there's standard pins, serrated pins, and spool pins. These are the things above the key pins. And if you make them different shapes like this, you can make them lock against the cylinder as you're trying to pick them. Not very common in like lock or padlocks. I imagine house locks might have some of these, but as this is a spool pin here, the idea is that it locks itself against the wall and it becomes harder to pick. Now, with a spool pin, you just move slightly back and you can push it back up again, and it doesn't really do that much, but it's makes it a little bit more difficult. So yeah, okay, I kind of blazed through these because again, I'm not that experienced, but now's the time where we try our own locks or our UF sit locks. So yeah, cool. I can stop recording now, right?